Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Passenger, which is episode 8 of season 1 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Deep Space Nine one episode at a time. In this video I cover the first season episode, The Passenger. So The Passenger is the episode where Bashir goes to the ship where a security officer is carrying a criminal who started a fire to try to escape from his prison, but he dies in the attempt. But the security officer continues to insist afterward that the criminal is in fact still alive. Bashir thinks that she's being ridiculous because he did all these scans and see that he's clearly dead, but she continues to insist that he's alive, and moreover that he's trying to hijack a shipment of Deridian coming to the station. And so Odo has to deal with the new Starfleet security officer, trying to make arrangements for this shipment coming, and the station continues to get sabotaged, which the security officer insists is consistent with the MO of the supposed dead criminal. Well, eventually they deduce that the criminal may in fact still be alive, that he just put his consciousness into the brain of someone else and is just lying dormant until he's ready to take over the body to do his criminal-esque stuff. And they assume that it is the security officer that he had taken over, but it turns out it was actually Dr. Bashir. And Dr. Bashir, the criminal takes over his body and tries to hijack the shipment and kills all the crew on board and threatens to destroy the whole the ship, which would spread the Deridium throughout the system, which would make all the planets uninhabitable. But Dax, at the last second, comes up with a brilliant plan to shock the criminal out of Bashir, or at least make Bashir conscious long enough to drop the shields, which he does, and they beam him aboard, and then they remove the evil criminal from Dr. Bashir's body and put him in a nice little flashy disc, which the security officer then promptly destroys. So, let us not beat around the bush here, okay? Let's not bury the lead, as they say. Let's just tackle it straight on. The thing I remember most about this episode, and the thing I think that most people remember most about this episode, is that this features what is probably the worst performance of a main cast member in a Star Trek show ever. And that's a bold statement considering William Shatner was a main cast member, and that Avery Brooks is also a cast member on this show. But yeah, I think this I'm referring to Alexander Siddig's performance of Vantika when he had taken over Bashir's body. So we talk a lot in other episodes about how hard it is to play like another character inhabiting that character's body, and that it's difficult. And I think I take it for granted how difficult it is, because a lot of these actors, like good actors, make it look easy. Like Jerry Ryan does a fucking amazing job. Even Kalmini and Marita Sirtis did a really good job on Power Play. Brent Spiner does this several times, and I think he does a good job. Even in Masks, I think it's underrated. His performance in Masks, which I'll get to, in that episode overall, gets more hate than it deserves, but I'll get to it when I get to it. And he definitely does like a way better job here. And yeah, a lot of Jerry Ryan did several times, like Body and Soul, and the one where all the past people she assimilated takes over her body, whatever. What's that episode called? regression or something. No, the regression's a different episode. It's like, I can't remember. It'll come to me later. But anyway, so there's more. There's probably more. Even fucking, speaking of William Shatner, even he does a better job in the episode Returns to Tomorrow, as well as, of course, Leonard Nimoy. But obviously he would do a better job because he's an amazing actor. But yeah, even Shatner does a better job, although not in Turnabout Intruder. That was bullshit. But I would say that Alexander Siddig's performance here is worse even than Shatner's performance in Turnabout Intruder. And that, my friend, is a very bold statement, because that is definitely one of the worst performances ever. The other performance I actually think that's a runner-up for worst performance by a main cast member would be Robert Picardo's evil doctor in the episode Darkling in season 3, where like they do a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing, where this evil thing, program takes over, and he's like evil and he talks like this. That's one of the worst performances ever. But this one, my friend, is even worse. I would say definitively that this is the worst performance of a main cast member in Star Trek. So, to be fair, Alexander Siddig talked about how hard it was. He said it was the hardest thing that he ever had to do in the first 2 seasons of Deep Space Nine, and he said that he failed. And, you think? I just don't know what... I think not only did he fail, I think the director failed. I talked about this before, I think, when I did my season-long review, that this is a bad director. Or at least maybe he wasn't bad always, but he was definitely bad on this shoot. Maybe he was too busy, or he's too busy thinking about other things. But any halfway decent director would see that performance out of Alexander Siddig and be like, wait, what was that you're doing with your voice? What are you doing there? Don't do that. Just don't do something else. Don't do that. So the director, it's a failure on the director's part too. And honestly, I think that the producers should have ordered reshoots. Now, someone in my Patreon comments points out something I did not realize, and I'll address that more when I get to the Patreon comments. But apparently, they did redub. He redid the audio for his performance, and because they said the performance was terrible. Now, if that's true, I really want to see this performance as even worse than that. I can't imagine that it being any worse than this, honestly. It's this body looks pretty good on me, don't you think? It sounds like the way someone would sound when they're trying to be a bad actor, when they're making fun of bad actors, hi, my name is Bashir, don't you think? But he's doing it seriously. He's seriously... Now, to be fair, not the entire performance is not terrible, but none of it's good. But some of it is definitely worse than others. You will release your hold on us. I think you would not... I could hear, that the script was written well. And that what they were going for. But my God, he could not possibly botch this performance anymore. Now, this performance is so bad that in the past, I believe a decade ago or something like that, a long time ago, I used to have this in my top 5 worst episodes of DS9. Now, it's no longer that. After I rewatched it, I was like, no, there's actually a lot more worse episodes of Deep Space Nine. Even in Season 1, for a second, excuse me, even in Season 1, there were worse episodes than this. But it's mainly that performance. That is like, that just made me go like, oh, what in the fuck is he doing? I just, yeah. But after watching the episode as a whole, and I realized this when I did my season-long review too, is that it's not that bad. I mean, there's other things about the episode that are decent, like before we get to the terrible performance. Like, that terrible performance does tank the ending, though. But, I mean, there's other issues with it too, like the fact that it was fucking obvious from the start it was Bashir because they showed the guy like grabbing him by the throat, and it was the last person Bashir touched, and he was like, "Make me live," and then Dax found that the way he transferred it was through his fingernail, and we saw him clawing at Bashir right before he died, and I'm like, duh! It's fucking Bashir, and you want to scream at all the idiot characters who are like, oh, we think it's what's-her-face, we think it's the security officer. I'm like, you fucking idiots, it's very clearly Bashir. Like, and Kira should know this because she was fucking there. She was right there when she saw the fucking dude grab him, and, oh, Jesus Christ. So that part's frustrating. And another thing I found frustrating about this episode, I think one of the main reasons why I never liked it and it had never sort of connected with me, is that I don't like feel any connection to these characters or the situation. It seems just like thrown at us like these Insado, no, not Insado, I can't even remember what they're called, these stupid aliens that show up, and it's like all of a sudden they're like main characters, and I never heard of these aliens. I don't think they introduced them well enough. It just pop up out of nowhere, and like, oh, there's this criminal Vantika who was like supposed to be the main villain of the show, who's like, he takes over Bashir's body, yet we only see him for like 2 seconds at the start of the episode right before he dies. So why the fuck should I care about him? Why the fuck should I be worried about him taking over people's bodies? And yes, the security officer gives us all this backstory about all the evil shit he did, but I don't even know who the fuck the security officer is. They don't do a good job of introducing her. She comes out of nowhere too. So I just feel disconnected from the whole story, and it was hard to get invested in. And then they did that ridiculously terrible performance at the end. Now, that being said, there are aspects of this episode that are interesting. Like, I actually do like the Odo and Premmin conflict. Actually, that's one of the highlights of the episode for me. And but also seeing like Dax like put it together and realize that someone had taken over, that the Vantika or whatever had went in someone else's body. Like, that was interesting. And then trying to find it out, doing the whole investigation and seeing Quark like trying to do this shady shit. Yeah, like stuff like that was actually pretty interesting. And if you look past the very terrible performance at the end, it was actually a pretty intense standoff with the dude taking over Bashir's body, and it was pretty, exciting when they were able to free Bashir and beam him on board. But yeah, even when he comes on board, he's like, "Don't worry, it's me." Like, that's still a terrible performance. Yeah. Poor Alexander Siddig. It does prove that playing another character within the normal character you play is a difficult thing to do. But anyway, so I guess I'll talk about the Odo and Premmin thing. So Premmin will show up for 2 episodes, this one and Move Along Home, and then promptly disappears. And then a couple seasons later, at the start of season 3, they introduce Michael Eddington, who serves the exact same purpose as Premmin. and they kind of just pretend like they didn't already do this. Already have a Starfleet security officer show up and sort of step on Odo's toes, and Odo feels like, oh, you're neglecting me, blah, blah, blah. Like, they repeated this whole thing over again in season 3 and acted like they never did it before when they did. Now, Michael Eddington, of course, was more permanent, but he was very different. In some ways, I like Premmin better, in some ways not, because Michael Eddington, I'll get more to him when I get to season 3, but he was a generic antagonist, not necessarily bad guy, but he was always someone who was never, well, not never, there were sometimes he was. Sometimes he served the same purpose that Premmin served, which was to have another character there while Colmini was out filming, doing other films, while O'Brien wasn't there. Sometimes Eddington served that purpose, like Premmin did in these 2 episodes, and he was fine in those, but for the most part, whenever he showed up, he was being an antagonist. So they eventually, spoilers if you haven't seen the show, they eventually did turn him into a villain outright, and that was definitely not planned. I don't know if I go as far as say it was a retcon, but it was not planned. Like, they definitely thought of it on the spot that he was working for the Maquis. That was definitely never thought of before that episode. But anyway, I'll get to that when I get to that. But as far as Premmin goes, I mean, so part of the reason why I think he's better than Eddington is because he doesn't have that antagonistic feel. He actually sort of makes peace with Odo towards the end of the episode, where he admits, like, I thought of this because of you. Like, I learned from you, which I actually think was really, like, nice that he was. They kind of forget about this in the next episode, where he's back to being a dick to Odo, or being a dick to him, because he's not in Starfleet. Sorry. I'm not going to be able to cover Move Along Home because I already did that. I'll just be doing a revisited, so I have to get my Move Along Home quotes in where I can, for those of you who aren't Patreon supporters. But anyway, Alamarine! Anyway, sorry, I just had to say that. But anyway, so I like the way he was portrayed in this episode. And the fact that they artificially made Eddington a villain or adversary when he didn't need to be, I think is a knock against him, whereas Premmin was actually portrayed as a more sort of healthy relationship. At first he was questioning everything Odo did, but then Sisko sort of put him in this place and being like, no, you should learn from Odo, and he does. And he does learn from Odo. And when Odo was like, where the hell have you been? And he's like, actually, I found this thing that would have fucked up the whole station. Odo's like, huh. Good job. And it actually gave him credit when he went to Sisko. So Odo and Premmin both learned to work together. So I like that. I like that progression. As I said, I think they kind of step back on this and Move Along Home, and then you never see this character ever again. But for this episode, I think it worked. But now the one thing I think Premmin has against him, as compared to Eddington, is that he's fucking annoying. I know it's not this episode, it's the next one where he goes, Constable Odo, good morning to ya. Like, he's just a big goofy. That, I don't know, has the dad vibes, I guess. Which, and in this episode, he has that a little bit. Like, the way he's like, flat out questions Odo, is like, oh, do you always announce the secret things in front of everybody? And it's kind of a dick at first. It's kind of annoying. But as I said, like, the two of them work it out in the end, which I do like. So, yeah, good things and bad things about him. I just didn't like the fact that they repeated the same storyline over again with Eddington and tried to pretend like this never happened when it did. Not saying, just saying. Now, as for Quark, this is a very interesting episode for Quark as well, because this is the most sort of evil we see him being, or like involved in the most sort of shady shit. And I kind of chalked that up to being an early episode. Yeah, some people had commented on this, and Armin Shimmerman had to try to like justify it and be like, "Oh no, he's just a middleman," so it's kind of in his character. But even so, even just being a middleman, he helped this, murderous outlaw hire mercenaries who beam aboard a supply ship and proceed to like murder the bridge crew. And he even says, he goes to the other crews, like, if they give you any trouble, kill them. So they could have theoretically killed even more crew members off screen. And that was brutal, and that's Quark facilitated that. Now, of course, Quark didn't kill anyone himself, and he could make that excuse being like, "Oh, I'm just the middleman." But he hired like murderers to go hijack and pirate a ship and murder the crew in a brutal fashion. I think that's I would probably be as bold to say that's even worse than when he was like selling weapons. I don't know. Because, I see a more direct path to him being involved in people getting killed here than I did to when he was selling arms in season 5. And what was the episode called? Business as Usual. And when that happened, like, the whole crew ostracized him and, like, refused to associate with him and were, like, giving him the cold shoulder for selling arms. Yet here, he doesn't seem to face any consequences. I guess there's also invasive procedures when he helped the Klingons take over the station. Or those, the Klingon mercenaries, I should say. It was that Trill dude who took over the station. And so, so that was also bad. But I think this is probably the worst we've ever seen him. I really can't. He's basically could have been charged with accessory to murder. I honestly, I don't know. That's just me. It's just I was surprised how dark they actually went that. But as I said, it was an early episode, and then in later episodes they sort of play him back as more of being involved in sort of petty stuff. And that's the thing, because if he was doing anything this heavy, like, why wasn't Odo like being the glass or whatever? Especially when the security officer warned Odo about it, and she was climbing around the top. Like, Odo should have been there as like a suitcase or something. So I don't know how Quark could have gotten away with doing something as blatant. I think that's why he does stick to sort of petty shit that Odo doesn't really care that much about. But anyway, I just found that interesting. Other than that, there's really not much to this episode. Like, it's, I guess the guest star was okay. Who played the security officer. But, again, it's like, they didn't really develop her that much, and I wasn't really invested in her storyline and her feud with Vantika, and then Bashir sort of fucked it all up with, and it was so obvious it was Bashir too. So there's really nothing more to talk about this episode. It's just kind of there. Anyway, I would now like to thank my Patreon supporters for supporting me on Patreon. It's very much appreciated. It does help me continue with my channel. I'd like to give a big special thanks to Brandon Neil Howes and Antarius. Thank you both so very, very much for your strong support. I would also like to give a shout out to Greg Marley, Francisco Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky Matty Jester, Joel Valls, Alessandro Miguelacero, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. So, we have a few patron comments on this episode. First comment is from Kyrie091, who says, "The passenger, more like the assenger." Mark, I'm going to level with you. I have no recollection of this episode. I read a plot synopsis on Wikipedia, and I still have no memory of this episode at all. See, this is why Endgame is a great episode. It's so bad that you'll never forget how much you hate it. See, I don't think that makes an episode great. I think it makes it memorable. Like, episodes that you remember for being terrible are worse than the forgettable episodes. And I agree. This is definitely a forgettable episode. I can totally get why you can't remember which episode this is, because it doesn't really stand out in either way, other than Alexander Siddig's absolutely terrible performance. Other than that, it's kind of a really forgettable episode. So next comments, God, I gotta get my singing voice ready, is from Norman Buckwald, who says, I look through my window so bright, I see the stars come out tonight, I see the bright and hollow sky, over the city is a red black sky, and everything looks good tonight. Singing la 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 la. Yeah, I could have done better. I'm not that familiar with that song, but I do recognize it. Of course, it's Iggy Pop. They played that at my old work where I used to work. They had a playlist that would play over and over again. They would change it up every once in a while, but some songs were there the whole time, and I worked there for like 4 years, and this is one of the songs that was there the entire time, so I heard this song a lot. It was actually the first time I ever heard it, though, so I'm not very familiar with Iggy Pop. And Norman Buckwald's about to mention that Susie and the Banshees did a cover of it, which I think I might have heard that at my work too, but only once or twice. And when I heard it, I was like, oh, this is weird. It's a cover. And in fact, I didn't know who did the original, if it was Iggy Pop or Susie and the Banshees, but it was Iggy Pop. I liked both. I was hearing the Susie and the Banshees one. It was pretty good too. Anyway, Norman Buckwald says, sorry about that. This song goes through my mind, whether it's Iggy Pop's version or Susie's version, whenever I see this title. Okay, we know years later in this series and watching him in other series that Alexander Siddig is a fine actor, but at this point in the series, oh no. The slow-speaking evil Vantika speech is actually a dub over whatever Siddig originally did, which was considered horrendous, but had to be slow to try to match his mouth on screen. As for the mystery and possession of the week goes, this was definitely standard, although the character of Kajada was a bit interesting, being the obsessed security officer, but otherwise this is simply not good. I guess it does introduce us to evil Bashir, usually possessed or copied, and spoiler, usually a changeling, but not in a good way, as the later evil Bashirs are massively superior. As for the outfits on the ship Bashir takes over, what in the world? Was Vantika taking them out due to crimes of fashion? 1, I am evil pyramid hands together out of 10. Oh, did he do the pyramid hands? So the thing I learned about this, you might know, a lot of people know, is that it's not necessarily, when someone does this, it doesn't necessarily say that they're evil. It symbolizes power. So people who feel powerful or have power over others will do this, or at least that's what they say, the pyramid hands. And so I suppose they do have villains do that a lot in shows, because it shows that they have power. Like, I always remember this episode of Stargate SG-1 when Daniel turned, what's his name? Daniel... God, why can't I remember his last name? Because they said it all the time. But anyway, he turned evil. And because some alien shit turned him evil, and then when he was like starting this nuclear war or whatever, they showed him sitting in his chair doing the pyramid hands. So yeah, I guess they had to. Anyway, the song, by the way, the Iggy Pop song, was The Passenger. I don't think I mentioned that earlier, which is the name of the episode. That's why I brought it up, in case you were wondering why we're talking about this song all of a sudden. I'm the passenger. Yeah, he didn't include that part in the thing. But anyway. Yeah, that's wild that they had Alexander Siddig overdub because they hated his performance. I do not see how this performance could be any worse. Like, the fact that I can now see it, that who's speaking slowly so the lips had to match it, but that was part of the problem. Like, it felt so unnaturally the way he was speaking slowly. He was like, "It looks good on me, don't you think?" Like, I don't know. I really don't see how the original performance could be any worse than what we saw on the screen. And if it was, I really want to see it. I really do. Anyway, next comment is from Antarius, who says, "The story did have potential, but the execution was bad. I liked how Odo's way of handling things was questioned, but this part of the story remained underdeveloped in the end. Why is Sisko so harsh towards Lieutenant Premmin? Doesn't he doesn't want to hear his opinion, and when he said clear, it was so over-the-top aggressive. Premmin should have reported finding sabotage device right away. That was unprofessional. The only other thing I liked was the use of the stun setting of the phaser in the end. In a way too many episodes, they forget about it and have a fist fight instead. Siddig's acting as the villain was really bad, especially his slow-paced speaking. At least after he attacked Quark, it was more than obvious he was the possessed person, because his voice was clearly recognizable, and we even see his face for a split second. Because of that, middle part of the episode was very boring, because there was no mystery left. The last part after that, hijacked the ship, was okay until they used technobabble to solve the situation. My rating is a 3 out of 10. Yeah, it's not very often that they use technobabble, or it'll be less often as the show goes on that they'll use technobabble to solve the situation, but I don't know. I didn't really have an issue with that. I did have more of an issue with Siddig's terrible acting. But, no, you do make a good point that Lieutenant Premmin should have reported the device right away, but they needed to have that cool scene of Odo being like, "What the hell are you doing?" Him being like, "I'm being like you," which was kind of nice, but, yeah, it doesn't actually make sense. But as for Sisko being aggressive towards Premmin, I actually bought that. I actually kind of liked that, because Premmin came on here throwing his weight around and questioning Odo and being like, "Oh, this Odo guy sucks," and Sisko had to be like, put him in his place and be like, "No, Odo's fucking awesome and you could learn from him, so stop being a dick and fucking work with him," which is what I think he needed to do. So I loved how he did that. I think that was actually perfect. But speaking of Avery Brooks being over the top, there was a moment at the end of where Dax came up with the plan to, fry the thing out of Bashir or whatever by sending a pulse through the tractor beam. But he was talking to Vantika, and he was saying, "Okay, we're going to stop the tractor. We're going to disengage the tractor beam now." And he turns to Dax. It's like, "Dax, do it." Meaning, although Vantika thinks he's saying disengage the tractor beam, but really what he's saying is send the pulse over. But the way Avery Brooks plays it, he's like, "Dax, are you ready?" And she's like, "Yeah." He's like, "Do it!" And all exciting like that. over the top. And it's like, that should have tipped Vantika off immediately, because why would, if someone was just saying disengaging the tractor beam, they wouldn't be like, do it! Good old Avery Brooks. Anyway, next comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who says, the first 20 minutes of this episode is great with some horror elements. When I first saw this episode, it was obvious that Dr. Bashir was Rio Vantika. How can I be 100% certain of that? Kira and Kajata are females and this voice was male. So when the episode tried to trick us that maybe Kajata is actually Vantika, it fails miserably. Maybe the director, Paul Lynch, was having a smoke break and forgot Rio Vantika was dead. Well, maybe Paul Lynch was having a smoke break when fucking Alexander Siddig was giving his performance, too. Anyway, Odo didn't want to play security guards with Lieutenant Premmin, so he told Sisko he wanted a transfer for another station, but Sisko told him he will be fired after the next episode. I know that didn't happen, but it's better than saying Odo goes into Sisko's office to cry and resign. The last 5 minutes of this episode is terrible, so my rating is 7. Odo, I'm watching you, Quark. Quark, I'm watching you, Jadzia. Steven, I'm watching this episode. Mark, I'm reviewing this episode out of 10. Oh yeah, I forgot about that line where he goes, Odo says, I'm watching you, Quark. Actually, he's not watching him, because he should have seen him meeting with those fucking mercenaries. But anyway, he says, I'm watching you, Quark. And Quark says, and I'm watching you, Jadzia. I remember the promo, the trailer for this episode. It's funny because I'm watching TNG on Blu-ray and they have all the promos. They have the episode trailers and the Blu-rays, but and so I hadn't seen them in years. But the DS9 DVDs is what I'm watching. They don't have the episode promos, so it's a shame. But I remember this one because they tried to play it off like a suspenseful thing where Odo says, "I'm watching you, Quark," and Quark says, "I'm watching you," and it makes it sound like he's talking about Odo, but he's actually talking about Jadzia. They just cut off the part where he said Jadzia in the trailer. Anyway, I should have mentioned the TNG trailers more often. I kept saying that I would because the ones from Season 1 to Season 5 are really cheesy. Like, on the next Star Trek. It's like so 80s-ish. But then Season 6, where I'm at now, they actually updated it and it actually is decent. And so all of the DS9 ones are decent as well. I remember I actually used to, during Season 6 of TNG and Season 1 of DS9, I think even over into Season 2 of DS9 and Season 7 of TNG, I used to record all the trailers and make like a little compilation of all the trailers. So I'm like really intimately familiar with them. That's why I remember them. And then there's the Voyager trailers, which is a whole other thing, which unfortunately you can't watch the original UPN trailers because they were fucking stupid. But anyway, Stephen also, like me, likes to take this opportunity to talk about Move Along Home, saying the Odo and Quark scenes are the only good thing about this episode. So my rating is 4. Boimler, get back here. You're always getting people trapped inside games. Stop trapping people inside games. Out of 10. Lower Decks reference for those of you who don't watch Lower Decks. But yeah, plenty of other things you could say, like I'm not in Starfleet or Alma Rain or please. Anyway, God, I love Move Along Home. I'm sorry, I do. I upgraded from a 6 to a 7. No, I'm not. Maybe I will. I don't know. We'll see how I feel. But it's just so... I love the cheesy in it. I don't understand why people hate that episode. It's so cheesy. It's fun. Anyway. So next comment is from Ricky, who says... This episode sucks. I wasn't invested in it, although to be fair, there were some good parts in this episode, like the way Odo was conducting the investigations, and some good character beats, but by the time Bashir is possessed by the criminal, I'm sorry, but this was horrible acting by Alexander Siddig. I mean, I couldn't take it seriously. He was just speaking very slowly and very monotone and was so laughably bad. And the criminal was two-dimensional, not interesting, so another bad episode of Season 1, so my rating is a 2 out of 10. All fair points. Siddig's acting was, as I said, I think the worst performance from a main cast member in the entire franchise, and the criminal was very two-dimensional. They did not take the time to sort of develop either of these characters, but I still kind of like this episode maybe a little bit more than you did. Thank you, patrons, so much for your comments. So my rating for The Passenger out of 10 is going to be a 4 poor, which I believe was the same rating I gave it when I did my season-long reviews as well. Even though I didn't say it in my video, I wrote it down. Where before I'd give this episode a 1. I don't think I'll give it the benefit of the doubt because the premise was somewhat interesting, even though I didn't feel invested or attached in these guest characters at all. But it was still stuff like the Premmin and seeing him work with Odo, like that was interesting. I like how that played out. It was interesting seeing Quark freaking be an accessory to murder and get away with it. That was somewhat interesting. And some of the whole Odo investigation thing, just seeing how he works and that was like really good stuff. And then Dax also figuring out the science of it. I think it was a good episode for Dax too. But yeah, the fucking performance by Alexander Siddig completely tanks this episode. It prevents it from being good. It definitely gets a poor rating alone, just for that performance alone. But on top of that, yes, they make it too obvious that's Bashir from the beginning, to the point where all the audience knows, like, duh, it's Bashir, and the characters come out like idiots for not realizing that it's Bashir. And yeah, they don't really introduce Vantika very well, and so you never really get that attached. And so it is ultimately a forgettable episode that's just kind of there. So anyway, that is it for my review of The Passenger. So coming up on my channel, Thursday, I'll be over on Patreon to do a revisiting my review for Move Along Home, as they say. Yes, I will get to talk about that episode, but unfortunately just with my Patreon supporters. And then on Saturday, I'll be back here for another public review for The Negus. And on Monday, we'll be reviewing Die Hard on a Starship, otherwise known as Starship Mine, and on Wednesday, sticking with TNG with Lessons. So that's what's coming up on my channel. Be sure to check it out as I continue to cover Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Next Generation, and many more shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.